What's the extent of US military aid to Israel in its war on Gaza? Washington has been sending military assets to the region, saying they're for deterrence purposes. But are they really? And could it trigger a wider conflict in the Middle East? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Refugee camps, hospitals, apartment blocks, nowhere in Gaza is safe in Israel's bombardment of the besieged territory. The humanitarian needs are dire and growing by the minute, yet Israel's biggest ally, the United States, is still not calling for a ceasefire. Instead, it's sending more military assets to the region. Washington says the aircraft carriers and naval support vessels will serve as a deterrent. But could American troops join the war? And what would this mean for the Middle East? Plenty for us to discuss with our panel in a bit. But first, this report from Sarah Gill.
A grim milestone. 18 days into the war on Gaza, the Israeli bombardment has killed more than 5,700 Palestinians. Daily life in the besieged territory is synonymous with the unpredictability of airstrikes. But throughout the offensive, the United States has maintained an unwavering commitment to Israel.
We must be crystal clear. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel. And we will make sure Israel has what it needs to take care of its citizens, defend itself, and respond to this attack.
While international calls for an immediate ceasefire grow louder,
ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
The US and other Western allies have refrained from asking Israel to scale back its attacks on Gaza. Instead, Washington has sent not one, but 2 aircraft carriers and their strike groups to the region. Each has roughly 7,500 military personnel. It's one of the largest deployments of US troops to the Mediterranean in decades.
This additional deployment sends another message to those who would seek to widen this conflict. As President Biden said earlier, and as you've heard me say, if any group or any country is looking to widen this conflict and take advantage of this very unfortunate situation that we see, our advice is don't.
Iran's foreign minister has accused the White House of double standards.
We've received messages asking us to practice restraint and also asked us to invite others to show restraint, but the US over the past 2 weeks has been sending military equipment to Israel. So how can they say they don't want the expansion of war? Now I'm saying to Biden, stop your hypocrisy.
The US hopes its support for Israel and its own increased military presence in the region will be enough to prevent the conflict from widening. But it's also clear that any miscalculation between Iran and the United States risks changing the dynamics of this war very quickly. Sarah Gill for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our panel of guests to discuss all this further. In Doha, we have Colin Clarke, who's Director of Research at the Soufan Group, a global intelligence and security consultancy. In New York, it's Omar Rahman. He's a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, where he focuses on Palestine, Middle East geopolitics and American foreign policy in the region. And in Boston, it's Carle, career CIA officer. He's a former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for transnational threats at the agency. Great to have you all with us to discuss what is going on in the region, and particularly what's going on with regard to the US deployments, because more and more US assets are going to the region, particularly naval assets. Some people say it's the biggest armada that's been seen in the region since the 1990s. Glenn, would you agree with that?
Well, I don't know if that's true, but I certainly believe that it is true. 2 aircraft carriers bring along as part of their combat, I forget the term slips my mind for the moment, but in any event, they deploy with probably a dozen ships or more each. So I think that's probably a true statement, yes.
And Colin, I've been looking, it's quite hard, quite opaque to get information off the Pentagon website, but reading through all the transcripts and everything that's out there in public, as Glenn says, I mean, we've got the largest warship in the world, the USS Gerald Ford. We've got another aircraft carrier, so 2 aircraft carriers, the Dwight D. Eisenhower, which is also there. And then I think a total of 8 warships in their 2 strike groups. And then we've got something called the Bataan Amphibious Ready Group, which has on 3 ships a total of 4,000 sailors and Marines on it. This is a very large deployment, isn't it, Colin?
Yeah, it's a massive muscular response from Washington. Multiple carrier strike groups, Patriot batteries, THAAD, missile defense.
Sorry, we're not going to allow any jargon. Just tell me what THAAD is, please, quickly.
Terminal high altitude air defense, missile defense, essentially force protection, deterrence, and then if need be, some potential offensive assets. There's also intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance on these carrier strike groups as well. So all around preparation from Washington in case things do escalate.
And Colin, staying with you, what is your reading of the main reason for sending so much to the region?
I think, first of all, it's deterrence. It's a warning to the Iranians. It's a warning to Iranian-sponsored groups like Hezbollah to remain on the sidelines, or at least to keep activity at a very low and manageable level. But again, it's also to protect the bases that the United States has in the region. It's about force protection. And lastly, it's about preparation. The Biden administration is still stung from the withdrawal from Afghanistan, how poorly things went there. And they want to be prepared in case they need these assets, including to evacuate American citizens from a number of countries in the Middle East.
Omar, let me ask you how you think this will be seen in the region, because one person's deterrence could be another person's provocation.
Yeah, I think opinion on this will be split in the region to some extent based on your relationship with the United States and where you're coming from and how you're viewing the current conflict. Although I think across the Arab world, there is heavy concern for this escalating. And, in some senses, maybe not a provocation, but certainly the U.S. is escalating the situation by bringing in huge naval forces into the region. And it's, in a sense, emboldening Israel to carry on what it's doing in Gaza. And that is obviously the source of the escalation at the moment. That is the reason why there's anger erupting across the Arab world. That would be the reason why you might see attacks on U.S. military bases in the region, or what we've seen, maybe Houthi rebels firing rockets towards Israel, if that's actually where they were headed. So at the heart of it, it's emboldening Israel, I think, to carry out this mission in the region.
Glenn, to see if I'm right with my assumption here. My assumption is that they're sending this big armada because they can't use their military bases, air base in Doha and their naval base in Bahrain because of the circumstances right now. Does that seem correct to you?
Partially correct. It certainly would be a complicating factor to use forces out of Doha, given Qatar's relationship with Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. However, I don't think that's really the primary reason. I think, as I believe it's Colin, the first speaker, said, clearly to me, the primary objective is deterrence, dissuasion. The buildup is not really to enable the Israelis to act, but rather to keep the conflict from spreading, becoming a regional or even broader war. And I think that most, we call them Arab governments, but they're, in this instance, it's more relevant to say Muslim countries, understand that and don't want to see the conflict generalize, and so really are accepting of the U.S. deployment. Now, what we call the Arab Street is another matter, and Muslims, of course, will be dissatisfied and angered by what they will characterize as a provocation. But to me, clearly, the objective of the United States is to stop Iran's proxies from so provoking Israel or the United States that the conflict generalizes into a wider war.
Colin, we've talked about the deterrence role, but there's also a role in protecting US assets that are already in the region. Let me read you a quote from the Pentagon Press Secretary, Brigadier General Pat Ryder. "We will do everything and take all necessary measures to protect US forces." We've already seen some instances with regard to what has gone on in the Red Sea and what has happened in Iraq and Syria. Let me take those one by one. First, in the Red Sea, there was a US warship, the USS Carle, which took down 4 land attack cruise missiles. We think they came from the Houthis. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, it seems likely. It's consonant with previous behavior and actions by the Houthis. And for the United States, it's just unacceptable. It's not going to allow its personnel or its bases to be targeted by any actor in the region.
And on that, Colin, do we know what the Houthis were aiming at? Because the Pentagon spokesman again said they took them down, but they didn't necessarily think they were aimed at the Carle and they were going in the direction of Israel. To your knowledge, do the Houthis have anything that could hit Israel?
It's possible. I think, they very well could have been headed that way. I think, one thing that this whole conflict has taught us is that we need to question prior assumptions, right? I think many people didn't think Hamas had the capabilities that it displayed on October 7th. So I would be very concerned about examining prior assumptions about the capabilities of Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi Shia militia, and others. I think, clearly the Iranians have helped them develop capabilities. They've given them all sorts of different hardware and missiles. And so at this point, we're still in the early stages of this conflict. We're hoping to keep it to a low boil. It's best to be in a defensive posture.
Glenn, we've also seen attacks in Syria and Iraq. There are still, based in Iraq, 2,500 US troops, and in Syria there are 900 US troops, but also a lot of military contractors. I mean, I think some people, to start with, would be quite surprised there are so many US troops still in Iraq and Syria. What are they doing?
Well, multiple missions. One, of course, is to continue to observe and try to stop ISIS or jihadist groups and elements from conducting terrorist operations and destabilizing things. Another is to help try to keep the governments in place from being destabilized further by such terrorist actions. And the third is, of course, to watch over, to the extent possible, Iranian efforts to extend its influence, which is a large component of what we're seeing happening with the Houthi, with the groups in Syria, with Hezbollah on the border, and with Hamas. And Iran is playing a cynical, very dangerous game. Destabilization and trouble, death and turmoil in Israel is a good thing for Iran because it's hostile to Israel on theological, philosophical, and political reasons, and two, because it helps Iran extend its influence. So one of the missions of the U.S. presence there is to try to keep this kind of destabilization from occurring and really to stop Shia, meaning Iranian, influence from spreading even further than it has.
Omar, apparently we think about 8 attacks on US troops in 4 different locations in Iraq and Syria. And it's interesting reading what's been said by the US hierarchy. I've quoted the Pentagon press secretary before. We don't necessarily see that Iran has explicitly ordered them, yet the White House and the Strategic Communications Coordinator John Kirby, we know that Iran is closely monitoring these attacks and in some cases actively facilitating these attacks. What's your view on how involved Iran is? Is Iran ordering this?
Whether they're ordering the attacks in places like Syria and Iraq, I mean, it's probable given their links to those groups that are operating in those countries. I think it was a little overstated. I think in terms of their connection to the initial Hamas attack on October 7th. I mean, clearly they're a sponsor, a financial backer, material backer of Hamas, but they're a lot of the reporting that came up out of October 7th. Implied or directly asserted that Iran was heavily involved in the planning process. I think that is overstating the connection. But certainly, I think their connection is much deeper to the armed groups that are operating in Syria and Iraq. And so, I don't know whether they're directly involved, but it's worth considering for sure.
OK, back to you, Colin, because you brought up that acronym THAAD in the first place. What the US is deploying, it seems, because of these specific attacks in Iraq and Syria, is this Terminal High Altitude Area Defence System, or THAAD, and also some additional, and there's no specified number here, Patriot battalions also. Just explain to me what these things do.
Patriot are missile defense batteries, surface-to-air missiles that are going to be used to guard against what we saw just the other day, against the numerous attacks and provocations from various Iranian-backed actors in the region. The United States and the Pentagon clearly expects more of that in the days ahead. And so this is, again, a defensive and precautionary measure to protect United States assets. It's nothing more, it's nothing less. The Iranians, for their part, are doing what they always do. They're continuing to attempt to push the United States out of the region and extend their own influence.
Glenn, we've got 2,000 extra troops, in addition to those Marines I told you about, who are at sea, and all the other naval personnel. 2,000 extra US troops are on standby to deploy with high readiness. I mean, what are the circumstances in which these troops could actually do something? Because one assumes you deploy troops, yes, you deploy them as a deterrence, but you have to think about when you might use them, and there might be circumstances when they could be used. What would you say to that?
This is where the line is not easy to draw very clearly, but I think the example of the Carney gives a good indication. The video that I think numbers of us have seen, which purports to be taken from the Houthi who fired the rocket, to an untutored eye such as mine, it appeared that it was firing at the ship, and you could hear the people saying, well, essentially, let's see what America does to that and take it America. But the response for the U.S. was to shoot down the missile and then to say it had occurred and do nothing else. In other circumstances, the military, the United States, would want to eliminate the threat, the perpetrator of an attack like that. But it hasn't happened. Why? Because it seems pretty clear that the description of the THAAD system that we just heard from Colin, I think it was, describes what U.S. objectives are, which is to parry attacks and to keep the violence, the war from spreading. If, however, U.S. forces and facilities were seriously harmed, Americans killed and capabilities destroyed, then it would be much more difficult for the United States not to use the 2,000 soldiers, Marines, I think they are, who are in place as a dissuasive measure. They are there not to be used. The success is not to see them have to be deployed. Failure of American objectives would be that the Iranian proxies succeed in causing such harm that the U.S. or Israel would feel obliged to respond with force rather than just countermeasures.
Omar, so if the US are attacked, that is what the forces are there for, and that's when they might actually be used. Do you see any other circumstances where these forces could be deployed, given how uncertain things are with regard to the war on Gaza and a possible escalation in the north, bringing in Hezbollah?
Yeah, I think the primary reason for them being there, and this was obviously mentioned, is, or the primary maybe cause of escalation would be if U.S. forces were attacked. But I think if there was a massive assault on Israel, say Hezbollah was to fire, thousands of rockets into Israel, you might see the United States respond. And I think that's obviously part of the reason it's there. I mentioned earlier, it's enabling the Israelis. Obviously, I didn't want to imply that the U.S. was seeking escalation in the region. The carrier forces are there to deter. But obviously, that type of deterrence is read by Israel as a kind of a license to do what it wants. And that can spark a type of escalation. So if it does come from Lebanon, or if it comes from elsewhere, Iran or Syria or Iraq, in kind of a massive scale, something that can't be handled with minimal effort, then I could see the U.S. getting involved in this. And that's a very slippery slope and a dangerous occurrence.
Colin, to you quickly. I mean, are there other possible roles, given you've got all of these naval assets there? Let me give you some examples. Could there be a role for them in extraction of US citizens who are being held captive? Could there be a role in intelligence and surveillance and whatever for Israel? I mean, I assume they have quite a lot of capabilities in that regard. And could there be a base for some sort of covert action by special forces?
Look, the troops are not purely ornamental. They're there for a reason. Again, I think this is largely about preparation. This is about the possibility of a NEO, a non-combatant evacuation operation, getting U.S. citizens out of the region if need be, logistical support. You mentioned intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. I think, as a very, very last resort, the U.S. would use them in a kinetic way. But really, the United States does not want to get involved in this conflict. This is purely about escalation management, and these are the assets that are being brought into theater to achieve that.
Glenn, we've talked about the possibility of the Northern Front becoming a second front, a two-front war. Some have even talked about the West Bank being a third front. And we've talked about the possibility of Hezbollah getting involved in this conflict actively. But there are also reports that the Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, has advocated a preemptive strike in the north against Hezbollah, who he says is 10 times more dangerous than Hamas. And so far, he's not won the argument in the Israeli war cabinet. But if Israel would do that, that puts the US then in a very difficult position, doesn't it, if it's Israel that starts the fight in the north?
Well, it could possibly be the case, yes. It would depend, everything always depends, on the size of a, quote, preemptive strike and the amount of damage, killing that are caused. It's certainly true Hezbollah, in conventional military terms, is exponentially more powerful than Hamas. And we all have, I think, heard the reports that Iran has provided Hezbollah with 120 to 140,000 rockets, many of which can strike any part of Israel. Their range extends well beyond the borders of the furthest point away of Israel. So Israel has a real legitimate concern about it is an attack from our assessments imminent, and would it be less dangerous to preemptively strike to try to stop that or not? And that's a very difficult equation. So far, consistently, the Israelis have shown restraint because they don't want to expand the war either. But that is the very complex equation that one has to make in real time when all decisions have negative consequences. If you go right, it's negative. If you go left, it's negative. And yet you have to go some direction. It's the hard challenge they have. But that certainly is why they would be considering a preemptive strike in the seemingly paradoxical objective of limiting harm, certainly, but expansion of the conflict, actually.
Colin, how much restraint does the US have, an ability to restrain Israel if it wants? I've read reports that there now is a US Lieutenant General, James Glynn, who previously headed the Marine Special Operations and was involved in the operations against ISIL in Iraq. He's been embedded now in the command structure at the Defense Ministry in Tel Aviv.
Well, it's unclear how much the United States can limit the Israelis' response. I do think Israel will listen to U.S. advisors. And again, I think the United States has little interest in watching this conflict escalate and has zero interest in getting dragged into it. So I think the United States is over there providing advice, hoping that cooler heads prevail. Let's not forget the human suffering involved here, the hostages that are involved, and the children that are dying every day in this conflict. This is heart-wrenching to watch. I think anybody with a heart is hoping that that this war ends sooner rather than later. And I hope the United States is helping figure out a way to bring the fighting to an end.
Omar, major military power projection like this also has a global diplomatic effect. How do you think this will be seen, this US troop presence in the region, by Russia and China?
A little difficult to say. Obviously, China has warships in the region that have been there for a while, but are kind of making a tour. So that dynamic, I think, creates a certain type of tension that we don't want to see escalate into that arena. How those powers are perceiving it, it's difficult to say. But I do know that how this has evolved, and if the Biden administration didn't want to see escalation, and I don't think it does. But its reflexive reaction to this whole episode from day one has brought us to this point. And if you didn't think it would bring us to this point, then this was a huge mistake on its end to think that an Israeli bombardment of the Gaza Strip without a real plan for the day after wouldn't bring us to this point. And so the whole thing has been a kind of a dangerous, reckless game that's escalating tensions in the region. And I don't think anybody really wants to see it evolve into something much worse. But that's kind of the direction we're headed in.
Glenn, can I end our discussion get your reaction to a grim anniversary that just passed 40 years ago? It was October the 23rd, 1983. That's when a suicide bomber hit the US military barracks in Beirut International Airport, killing 241 US servicemen. That was a disastrous moment in the US's involvement in the Middle East. And of course, now the president is Joe Biden. He not only knows his history, he lives it, because he was a US senator at the time. He said, we've got to change this crazy policy, as he introduced a resolution calling for the US withdrawal from Lebanon. What's your thought on that echo from history?
Some of my colleagues were killed in the attacks, the Marine barracks and the American embassy, which occurred not far distant in time from each other. One of the lessons that the U.S., some parts of the U.S., learned was the primary reason for those two attacks was that we were seen to have taken sides in fundamentally a civil war, but also between the Palestine Liberation Organization and Israel. And so we angered one of the sides enough to try to kill us. A tactical lesson that we learned was that the rules of engagement of the American forces deployed at the time were designed to avoid escalation, which is a laudable objective, but it meant that the response in real time was insufficient, meaning that some of our guards were not allowed to fire on an approaching suicide truck. And those rules of engagement subsequently changed. And I think in the current crisis, it is relevant because what we've all been talking about during this session is the advanced deployment of tremendous force and the repeated warnings that the United States will use it if provoked. If someone tries to expand the conflict,
okay,
that's a
Glenn.
lesson.
Glenn, thank you very much for that lesson from history. For all the talk of a pivot to Asia, it seems the US is being forced by events back to the Middle East. Thanks to all our guests, Colin Clarke, Omar Rahman and Glenn Carle. You can find much more detail on the conflict on our website. And if you want to watch this or any other of our programmes, go to aljazeera.com. If you have your own opinions on what you just heard, then post them on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We'd also like to hear from you too on X, formerly Twitter, where we are at AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and everyone on the team here in Doha, stay safe and bye for now.